They say you never truly see the end coming, not until it's already there, staring you in the face. But that's not true, not really. Looking back, I can see the warning signs clear as day. The slow fade of affection, the quiet moments that stretched too long, the conversations that felt more like obligations than anything meaningful. I ignored them. I told myself every couple goes through rough patches, that love wasn't about grand gestures, but about the small, quiet choices made every day. I truly believed that. Until the night Linnea chose a party over me. It wasn't supposed to be a special night. It wasn't our anniversary. There was no grand occasion. It was just us, at least, it was supposed to be. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing dinner, setting the table, making sure everything was perfect, because deep down, I had felt the distance growing. I wanted to pull her back, remind her of us, remind her of the life we had promised to build together. But instead of sitting across from me at our candlelit table, Linnea stood at the front door, slipping on her heels, barely sparing me a glance. "I won't be late," she said, adjusting her dress in the mirror. I stared at her reflection, at the woman I had loved for years, the woman who was once my best friend, my partner, my home. But at that moment, she felt like a stranger. "Linnea," I started, my voice quieter than I intended. "We had plans." She sighed, rolling her eyes as she turned to me. "Don't do this. It's just a party. Just a party. Just another night. Just another excuse." I should have argued. I should have told her how I felt, how tired I was of being second place in my own marriage. But I didn't. I just nodded, watching her walk out the door like it was nothing. Like I was nothing. I waited. I sat at the table, the food growing cold. I checked my phone once, twice, a dozen times. No messages. No calls. Just silence. By midnight, I knew she wasn't coming home soon. By 2 in the morning, I knew she didn't care. By sunrise, I had made my decision. I walked through the house, the home we had built together, but it felt different now. Empty. A shell of something that used to be whole. I packed a bag, not in anger, not in haste, but in quiet certainty. I wasn't going to wait around for someone who had already left me in every way that mattered. Before walking out, I placed my wedding ring on the counter next to a note. It wasn't dramatic, just 3 simple words. "You made your choice." And with that, I walked away. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. I didn't look back when I left. There was nothing left to see. The house I had poured years into, the marriage I had built, the love I thought was unshakable, it all felt like an illusion now. The moment the door shut behind me, I knew I was walking away from more than just a relationship. I was walking away from the version of myself that had spent too long waiting for someone who had already checked out. The roads were quiet in the early morning. A thick mist hung in the air, blurring the street lights, casting everything in a dull haze. I had no destination in mind, just the overwhelming urge to move. I drove aimlessly for hours, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, my thoughts spiraling in every direction. Was she even thinking about me? Did she even notice I was gone? Or was she still at that party, laughing, dancing, completely unaware that her husband had finally had enough? By the time the sun fully rose, I found myself pulling into a gas station on the outskirts of a town I didn't recognize. I filled up the tank, grabbed a coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, and sat in my car, staring at my phone. No missed calls. No texts. Not even a half-hearted, "Where are you?" It was confirmation of what I already knew. I could have vanished into thin air, and Linnea wouldn't have noticed. Something inside me cracked at that moment. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger. It was something worse, acceptance. I checked into a cheap motel with flickering neon lights and carpets that reeked of stale cigarettes. The woman at the front desk barely looked up as I handed her my ID, her nails clicking against the keyboard as she processed my reservation. "How many nights?" she asked in a bored tone. I hesitated. "Just one." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. That night, I lay on the rock-hard mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioning unit as it rattled in protest. My mind raced with memories, snapshots of a life that no longer felt like mine. The late-night talks Linnea and I used to have, the lazy Sundays in bed, the way she used to hold my hand absent-mindedly when we walked together. Where had all of that gone? Had it slipped away slowly, day by day, until we were nothing more than strangers living under the same roof? Or had it all been a lie from the start? I reached for my phone out of habit, my thumb hovering over her name in my contacts. I wanted to call her. I wanted to ask if she noticed I was gone. I wanted her to say something, anything, that would make me believe this wasn't all for nothing. But I didn't press dial. Instead, I powered off my phone and let the darkness swallow me whole. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, I would figure out what came next. But deep down, I knew there was no going back. Linnea had made her choice. Now, it was my turn to make mine. Morning came too soon, and I woke up with a strange sense of disconnection, as if the man lying in that dingy motel bed wasn't me. I stared at the cracked ceiling, the faded wallpaper peeling at the corners, and let the weight of reality settle onto my chest. I had really done it. I had walked away. Not in anger, not in a moment of emotional outburst, but in quiet, deliberate certainty. And yet, as much as I wanted to feel relief, all I felt was hollow. I forced myself to sit up, rubbing my face as I reached for my phone out of habit. Still nothing. No messages. No missed calls. No frantic texts asking where I was. No regretful apologies. I had been gone for nearly a full day, and Linnea hadn't even noticed. Or worse, she had noticed and didn't care. I let out a bitter laugh. What had I been expecting? That she would wake up, see the empty bed, and suddenly realize that she had taken me for granted? That she would call in a panic, begging me to come home, swearing that she had made a mistake? No, that was the stuff of movies. In real life, people don't suddenly have epiphanies about the love they've neglected. In real life, they just move on. I couldn't sit in that room any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, suffocating me with the stench of old regrets. I grabbed my bag, checked out of the motel without a word, and drove. Where? I had no idea. I just needed to go somewhere, anywhere that wasn't the past I had left behind. The road stretched endlessly ahead, miles of asphalt disappearing beneath my tires. I found myself driving toward places that once meant something to me, as if retracing the steps of a life I no longer recognized. The park where Linnea and I had our first date, where we had sat on a weathered old bench and talked for hours like we had known each other forever. The coffee shop where she had nervously played with her engagement ring when I proposed, trying to contain her excitement but failing miserably. The apartment we had shared before buying the house, the tiny one-bedroom where we used to dream about our future, where we thought we had forever. All of it felt like someone else's life now. A distant memory that belonged to a version of me that didn't exist anymore. Eventually, I pulled into a diner on the side of the highway. It was the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. Worn leather booths, faded menu boards, the faint scent of coffee and grease lingering in the air. It was quiet, mostly empty except for a few truckers and an old man reading a newspaper at the counter. I slid into a booth near the window and ordered a black coffee, barely acknowledging the waitress as she poured it in front of me. I sat there for a long time, staring at the steam rising from the cup, my mind circling the same questions over and over. What now? What did a man do after walking away from his entire life? Where did he go? Who did he become? As I took a sip of my coffee, I heard a voice behind me. Long night? I looked up to see a man in his 40s standing near my booth, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn-out jacket. He had the kind of face that had seen too much, tired eyes, deep lines etched into his skin, a quiet knowing in his expression. I could have brushed him off, could have given him the usual polite, dismissive response. But for some reason, I didn't. Instead, I let out a dry chuckle and shook my head. More like a long couple of years. He slid into the seat across from me without asking, nodding as if he understood exactly what I meant. Yeah, he said. I know the feeling. I should have been annoyed. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, especially not with a stranger. But something about him felt familiar. Like he had been exactly where I was sitting now. He motioned to the waitress for a refill on his coffee before turning his gaze back to me. You look like a man who just lost something, he said, studying me. Or maybe, a man who finally realized it was already gone. I stared at him, the words hitting me harder than they should have. Yeah, I admitted quietly. Something like that. He nodded again, as if confirming something to himself. You ever hear the story about the guy who waited too long to leave a burning house? I raised an eyebrow. No. The man leaned back in his seat, taking a slow sip of his coffee before answering. House catches fire in the middle of the night. The guy wakes up, sees the flames, but he doesn't run. He thinks maybe he can put it out. Maybe he can salvage something. So he hesitates. And in that hesitation, the fire spreads. By the time he finally decides to get out, it's too late. The house collapses around him. He set his cup down and looked at me. You did the right thing by leaving, he said simply. Doesn't mean it won't hurt like hell, but at least you're not trapped in the fire anymore. I didn't know what to say to that. For the first time since I had walked out of that house, I felt something other than numbness. I felt understood. And for the first time, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as lost as I thought. The sun had started to dip below the horizon by the time I left the diner, casting long shadows across the pavement. The man from earlier, Jack, as he had introduced himself, had left a while ago, leaving me with nothing but my thoughts and an untouched refill of coffee. I hadn't expected a conversation with a stranger to hit so hard, but his words lingered in my mind, circling like vultures over the corpse of my past. At least you're not trapped in the fire anymore. Was that true? Had I actually escaped? Or had I just walked into another kind of emptiness? I got back into my car, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I barely recognized the man looking back at me. He looked tired. No, not just tired. He looked lost. A man without a home, without a plan, without a future. For a long time, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the low hum of the radio. Then, without really thinking about it, I reached for my phone. It had been almost 2 full days since I left, and still nothing. No messages. No missed calls. Linnea hadn't reached out once. Maybe I should have felt relieved. Maybe I should have taken it as a sign that I had made the right choice. But all it did was confirm what I had suspected for a long time. She had stopped caring long before I walked out that door. Still, against my better judgment, I opened up her social media. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, some hint of regret, some cryptic post about losing something she never thought she'd lose. But no. There she was, in a new set of pictures, smiling under neon lights, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. Drinks in hand, head thrown back in laughter. It was like I had never existed. The worst part? I wasn't even surprised. I locked my phone and threw it onto the passenger seat, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This is what she wanted. She had been slipping away for months, and I had been fool enough to keep holding on, thinking I could somehow pull her back. I should have known better. I put the car in drive and pulled out onto the empty road, the headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay still. I drove for hours. Past towns I'd never heard of, past highways that stretched endlessly into the night. I wasn't running. I told myself that over and over. I was just figuring things out. At some point, I found myself in front of a rundown motel off the interstate. The kind of place where people want to disappear. I checked in without asking questions, took the key, and let myself into a room that smelled faintly of mildew and regret. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, my mind drifting back to everything I had walked away from. The house. The memories. The idea of a future that had never really been mine to begin with. And for the first time since I had left, I let myself feel the weight of it all. The truth was simple, and it hit me like a gut punch. I had spent so long trying to save a marriage that had already died, and I was the only one who hadn't realized it. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion settling deep in my bones. Tomorrow, I would figure out my next step. Tomorrow, I would decide what came next. But for tonight, I just let myself grieve. The motel room was quiet, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, like it had settled in long before I arrived and was waiting for me to notice. The dim yellow light from the bedside lamp cast long, eerie shadows against the cracked walls, and the old air conditioning unit rattled in protest every few minutes, struggling to keep the room from becoming unbearably stuffy. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, but my mind wasn't in that room. It was back in the house I had left behind, trapped in memories that no longer felt like they belonged to me. I hadn't slept in nearly 2 days, but exhaustion didn't bring me any closer to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, my thoughts spiraled into the past, back to the moments I had ignored, the slow unraveling of a marriage I had convinced myself could still be saved. I had been blind. Or maybe, deep down, I had known for a long time but refused to face it. The bed creaked beneath me as I shifted, grabbing my phone again, even though I already knew what I'd find. Nothing. No messages, no missed calls. Linnea still hadn't reached out. I should have been angry. I should have felt betrayed. But the truth was, I felt something far worse. I felt nothing at all. She wasn't wondering where I was. She wasn't worried. She wasn't even curious. I had simply disappeared, and she had let me. I forced myself to put the phone down, staring at the ceiling once more. The realization settled deep in my chest, heavier than I expected. I had spent years fighting for a place in her life, and in the end, I had been the easiest thing for her to let go. I don't know how long I lay there, lost in that thought, before sleep finally took me. I woke up to the sound of a car pulling into the lot outside. Groggy, disoriented, I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The cheap motel sheets tangled around my legs. The sun had already risen, its dull light leaking through the stained curtains. For a brief moment, I forgot where I was. The old instinct kicked in, and I reached out beside me, only to find the bed empty. Of course it was. Shaking off the lingering sleep, I stood up and splashed some cold water on my face in the tiny motel bathroom. The reflection that stared back at me looked different. Not in any obvious way, but there was something missing. The man in the mirror looked like he had finally stopped hoping. I grabbed my jacket, slipping my phone into my pocket, and stepped outside. The crisp morning air hit me instantly, a stark contrast to the stuffy motel room. I needed coffee. Something normal. Something grounding. The nearest diner was a short walk down the road, a small, outdated place with foggy windows and a neon sign that flickered erratically. I stepped inside, the scent of burnt coffee and greasy bacon filling the air. The place was nearly empty, except for an older couple in the corner and a waitress who looked like she had seen it all. Sliding into a booth near the window, I ordered a black coffee and sat in silence, staring out at the empty road. My mind kept drifting back to Linnea, to our home, to the way things used to be. I had spent so long believing we were unbreakable that even when things got bad, we would find our way back to each other. But we hadn't. And now, I had no idea what came next. The waitress brought my coffee, refilling my cup before I had even taken a sip. "Rough morning?" she asked, eyeing me like she already knew the answer. I let out a dry chuckle. "Something like that." She smirked, shaking her head. "Honey, I've been waitressing for 20 years. I know a man who just lost something when I see one." I stared at her for a moment, debating whether to say anything. But what was the point? What could I even say? That my wife had been slipping away from me for months, and when I finally decided to walk away, she didn't even care? That I had spent the last 2 days driving aimlessly, waiting for some kind of sign that I had made the right decision? Instead, I just nodded. "Yeah," I admitted quietly. "Something like that." She patted the counter with her hand before walking away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I pulled out my phone again, scrolling mindlessly, when something stopped me cold. A notification. Not from Linnea. No, of course not. From an old friend. "Hey man, I don't know if you want to hear this, but I thought you should know, Linnea's been posting pictures from last night. Looks like she had a hell of a time." I didn't want to open the message. I didn't want to see. But I did. And there she was. Still wearing the dress she had left in. Smiling. Laughing. Surrounded by people I didn't know. Her arm draped casually over a man I had never seen before. She wasn't heartbroken. She wasn't even thinking about me. She was celebrating. I felt my stomach twist, my grip tightening around the phone. I had known she wouldn't be broken up over this, but to see her so carefree, so completely unaffected. It hit harder than I wanted to admit. She had moved on before I had even left. I set the phone down, staring at the table, my chest tightening. I had spent the last 2 days wondering if she would notice I was gone, wondering if I had made the right choice. But looking at that picture, I realized something. She had never once wondered if she had made the right choice when she left me sitting at that dinner table. And now, I wasn't going to wonder either. I pulled out my wallet, threw a few bills on the table, and stood up. It was time to stop looking back. I drove for hours after leaving that diner, not toward anything in particular, just away. Away from the thought of Linnea, away from the weight of realizing I had been nothing more than a placeholder in my own marriage. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, mile after mile of asphalt, broken only by the occasional gas station or rest stop. I barely noticed them. I barely noticed anything. At some point, the fuel gauge warned me I had to stop. The tank was nearly empty, much like my patience for running in circles inside my own mind. I pulled into a small gas station on the side of the road, the kind that looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. There was a single rusted-out truck parked beside the pump, an old man rocking back and forth on the porch, watching the world pass him by. I envied him for that. I filled the tank, walked inside, and grabbed a cup of coffee, if you could even call it that. It was thick and burnt, the kind that felt more like punishment than caffeine. But I didn't care. It was something to hold, something to do with my hands while my brain kept cycling through the same thoughts over and over. And then, before I could stop myself, I pulled out my phone again. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe some part of me thought that Linnea would have noticed I was gone by now, that maybe she had finally realized something was off. But no. The first thing I saw was another notification. Another update from the life she was living as if I had never been part of it. A new photo. Her, sitting at a bar, a cocktail in hand, head tilted back in laughter. And beside her, the same man from the last picture. His arm wasn't just draped around her this time. He was whispering something in her ear, her body leaning into his. She looked happy. I didn't realize I had tightened my grip on the coffee until the cheap paper cup started to crumple. I forced myself to let go, setting it down on the counter before I could do something stupid, like throw it across the store. This wasn't just her moving on. This wasn't just her letting go of me. This was proof that she had already been gone long before I walked away. I don't even remember paying for the gas. I barely remember getting back in the car. The only thing I remember is the feeling. That crushing, undeniable certainty that my marriage had been over long before I had found the strength to admit it. I gripped the wheel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. This was it. This was the last time I was going to check her social media. The last time I was going to wonder what she was doing, who she was with, if she had noticed I was gone. Because the truth was, I had been gone from her heart long before I ever packed my bags. And now, it was time for me to make sure I left her behind for good. I pulled back onto the road. But this time, I wasn't just driving aimlessly. I had a plan, a destination, a place I had been avoiding since the moment I left. Home. Not the home I had shared with Linnea. That wasn't home anymore. It was just a house filled with ghosts of things that should have lasted but didn't. No, I was going back to where I had come from. The town I had grown up in, the people I had left behind when I thought I was chasing something better. I didn't know what I was expecting to find there. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't looking back anymore. The further I drove, the more distant Linnea felt, like she was dissolving into the past with each mile I put between us. I hadn't been back to my hometown in years, not since my father's funeral. Even then, I had only stayed for a few days before rushing back to the life I thought I was building with Linnea. Now, as I watched familiar road signs appear, I wondered if I had ever truly left this place, or if some part of me had been waiting for an excuse to come back. The town looked almost exactly the same. The same small grocery store on the corner, the same bar where I had my first drink, the same houses with the same families who had probably never moved. It was unsettling in a way, like time had frozen for everyone but me. I pulled into the driveway of a house that had once been home, my mother's house. The lights were on, casting a warm glow against the early evening sky, and for the first time in days, I felt something resembling comfort. I took a deep breath before knocking on the door, my pulse drumming in my ears. It only took a few seconds before the door swung open, revealing my mother in a worn-out sweater, her expression shifting from surprise to something softer. She didn't ask why I was there. She didn't need to. She just pulled me into a hug, and for the first time since I had left, I let my guard down. She stepped back, looking me over with sharp eyes. "You look tired," she said. "I am," I admitted. She nodded knowingly, stepping aside to let me in. The house smelled the same as it always had, faintly of cinnamon and old books. I dropped my bag by the door, suddenly feeling like a kid again, like I had run back to the one place that had always been safe. "Linnea," she asked cautiously as we sat in the kitchen, a steaming mug of tea in front of me. "She's—" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I left." Mom didn't react with shock. She just exhaled through her nose and folded her hands on the table. "I always thought she wasn't the settling kind." That stung more than I expected. "You never said anything. Would you have listened if I had?" I opened my mouth, ready to argue, but then I realized I wouldn't have. I had been too caught up in the idea of what my life was supposed to be, too eager to prove that I had chosen the right person, even if the cracks were already showing. Mom reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "You'll be okay," she said. "You just need time." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if I believed it. That night, as I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I had stuck to the ceiling as a kid, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I had left behind everything I had thought defined me, and now I had to figure out who I was without her. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside my window, something I hadn't heard in years. It was strange how quickly the small comforts of this town came back to me, the familiar creaks in the floorboards, the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting from the kitchen, the quiet hum of life moving at its own slow, steady pace. For the first time since I left Linnea, I didn't wake up with a knot in my stomach. There was no urge to check my phone, no lingering bitterness. Just peace. I got up, stretched, and made my way downstairs, where my mother was already at the table, flipping through a newspaper like she did every morning. She looked up and smiled. "Good morning, sweetheart. Sleep okay?" "Yeah," I said, realizing it was true. "Better than I have in a long time." She slid a cup of coffee toward me, watching me carefully. "So, what's next?" I didn't have an answer to that yet. And for the first time, that didn't terrify me. Instead of rushing to find a new direction, I let myself settle into the moment. I spent the day walking around town, revisiting old haunts that had once felt too small for me. The bookstore where I used to waste entire afternoons, the park where I had scraped my knees as a kid, the lake where I had learned to swim. The memories weren't painful anymore. They were just pieces of me I had forgotten. And then, something unexpected happened. As I was leaving the bookstore, a voice called out behind me. "No way. Is that really you?" I turned, and there she was, Chloe. I hadn't seen her in over a decade, but she hadn't changed much. The same warm smile, the same bright eyes that always looked like they were carrying some secret joke. We had been close once, before life pulled us in different directions. Before I thought I needed something bigger, something better. I smiled, genuinely this time. "Chloe. Wow. It's been forever." She laughed. "No kidding. I thought you disappeared off the face of the earth." "Something like that," I admitted. We ended up grabbing coffee at a small cafe down the street, falling into easy conversation like no time had passed at all. She told me about her life, about how she had stayed in town, working as a photographer. "I used to wonder if I should have left," she said, stirring her drink. "But I think I was always meant to be here." For the first time, I wondered if maybe I was meant to be here, too. We talked for hours, and by the time the sun started setting, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a hope. I didn't know where my life was heading next. But for the first time, that didn't scare me. I wasn't lost anymore. I was exactly where I needed to be. And for the first time in years, I was excited to see what came next.